says, Lo yadati, I didn't know that there was a problem with killing people. How was I supposed to know? No one told me. But that's really what he says when he says, Lo yadati. It's not that he was trying to tell Hashem, like, of course he knew Hashem knew that Hevel had been killed. But he was trying to say, I didn't know I was responsible for him. Okay? So he says, what he's saying is, he's not saying, I didn't know, am I my brother's keeper? What he's saying is, I didn't know I'm my brother's keeper. I didn't know I was responsible to try to not kill him, to try to keep him in good health. I didn't know that I was obligated to watch over the head of my brother so that he shouldn't be killed by me. And he quotes another passage about what Shmira means. That's the kind of it. The Amar lo b'kadosh baruch hu, lo yadata. Hashem says, what do you mean? How did you not know? This is an obvious, logical mitzvah. You don't need someone to tell you this. And when he says the voice of your brother's blood is crying out to you from the ground, what he's really trying to say is your logic would teach you this mitzvah even if you never were commanded it. Because without this mitzvah, if you would just go around killing people when you felt like it, humanity would just destroy itself. Right? You can't possibly not know this. So I'm just finish this and I'll take your questions. Okay? And the world will be desolate with no inhabitants. Right? The earth itself. What he's saying is, when he says the earth, the voice of your brother's blood is crying out. He's saying the earth itself is seeking vengeance. The earth can't continue this way. The world can't be sustained if people just kill people when they want to. And so that image of the earth is crying out is you didn't need anyone to tell you this. This is obvious. The world can't exist this way. Taylor, what was your question?
So this kind of thing, it's clear that aside from the Torah, there's an innate moral compass that people have.
Yeah.
In general, in stories of Tanach before Mount Torah, which there's plenty of them, do you think that that's how they can be explained? That people just had this innate sense of what was right and what was wrong?
Yeah. So this perspective, I do think that one of the most powerful aspects of this story, and that it can be applied to other stories, is the Torah does have high expectations of people. Right? The Torah does things that are things people should be able to figure out basic morality without being. And not all mitzvah, not whatever, but things that are mustalah, right? Things that can be logically determined, the Torah expects people to be able to figure out. And so I do think there are definitely cases where there's that assumption that people should just know what's moral without having to be commanded it. Were you thinking of a particular story?
I'm thinking of I always have this question of was it Yitzchak who was learning all day? What was he learning when it was before Mount Torah?
Right. Right, so it's an interesting question. So I would think that midrash means that he was either learning about Abraham's insights into Hashem, right? Learning sort of about Hashem, or maybe learning about morality in this way. Probably not learning about
morality or halacha. Maybe it could have been halacha, but it's hard to explain how it would be halacha before.
Right, exactly. So maybe morality, or maybe sort of the ways of Hashem.
Do you think there were ideas going on before? Humans weren't brain dead.
Yeah, people were people.
People were thinking.
Right, exactly. People were always seeking meaning, right? That's Rabbi Sachs, that's how he refers to people as meaning-seeking animal, right? People, that's part of mankind. We seek meaning, and I think so. There were ideas about Hashem, about human experience, before
So this would have been one of them. He was having ideas and just that innate moral compass was supposed to tell him what was right and what was wrong.
Yeah, that's what I think the Theophar is saying here, and it sort of fits in with that idea that the exile wasn't instead of murder, but it was almost to show how bad it really was.
Isn't it clear that it's an innate ability because they exile?
Okay, so it depends, I think, on how you read the story of the Eitzada, right? You can definitely read it that way, but if you read it as just right, so if you read it as free choice, then it implies that they knew what they were choosing, right? You can read it that way, that eating snakes that I gave a free choice, and they have to have free choice, you have to know what's right and what's wrong, or it doesn't matter if you have free choice. But there are, we shouldn't read the Eitzah in like somewhat different ways, as like referring to like sexual awareness and things like that. But but you're right, definitely the Eitzah would like fit into that approach, for sure. You want to have a look over here? So what do you guys think about that idea that he was just supposed to know? That maybe one of the fundamental messages of this story actually is that people have an innate moral compass. You're responsible for it. You're not going to be taught everything. Some things you need to figure out on your own.
I agree. I was once in a class with a teacher and he was saying how like the whole point of Judaism, like he was given the example of like stealing, and without Judaism and having the idea that like Hashem was always watching, we would just steal. And I was like, well, that's having like such a lack of faith in like humanity that we have our own moral code. And then he was like, stop being such a naive idealist. Like the world, like we only do what we do because we know Hashem's watching.
So first of all, don't stop being an idealist.
Yeah.
Like, definitely don't. But yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. That like 100% the Torah believes in there are different kinds of mitzvah. There are mitzvah, there are mitzvah. And we're not the first people who figured out that it's wrong to steal.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's basically like even the first conventional philosophy will be.
No, he's like the kind of teacher that's like, Judaism is the foundation of morality.
Right. Okay. Right. So did you want to say something, Michaela?
I guess I agree with that to an extent, just because when I think of like children,
Yeah.
you know, fundamentally you have like 15 years or something where you are heavily influenced by guidance from your parents to tell you what's right and wrong. And I know that you have like this innate sense of like a consciousness, but like I think the less guidance you have from some sort of guardian, the more people don't understand how to act properly.
Right. So maybe there are like basics, like don't kill your brother, right? That that people are sort of innately born with, but certainly moral guidance is important.
I also think like it's nice to think that we all have an innate moral compass, and that like do not steal doesn't come from Judaism necessarily, but like there's also the other side of it, which is like we've evolved to realize that society just doesn't work when people kill other people and people steal things. Like it functions much better with certain laws in place, regardless of like the moral side of it. So I think the way Judaism phrases it is much more of like an eternal truth than like moral code, rather than like how best, and of course therefore society best functions that way. But I think like today what we've become is like society, like because so many religions and like tribalism and stuff like that have had to experience those things to come to this stage where we realize this is how society best functions. Like it's more like the moral code comes after like how like what laws are set in place, because that's how it best functions.
Human experience, right? There's definitely an interaction.
I agree with Ron, because I think like it's nice to think there's innate morality, but when you think back to like primitive man who engaged in like avodah zarah, they imitated gods of violence and tension, and when ethical monotheism was introduced into the world, like we became more moral beings.
Right. For sure, there's definitely an interaction between the two. So that's sort of one approach, to say that the reason he got exiled, so the death penalty it actually works. So he was exiled and then like a future death penalty, and he was sort of supposed to know this. There are other ways of viewing it. And we mentioned like sort of in passing in the past that maybe the reason he got exiled is because it actually was unintentional. Because he did it, not because it was unintentional in that he didn't know, like that he didn't need to kill Havel, but that he sort of didn't understand what he was doing. Right? In the same way that an unintentional killer gets exiled to an Ir Mikvat, and that is the punishment for killing someone accidentally is exile, but maybe that is actually why he was exiled here also. So this is sort of the polar opposite view. Right? This is the view saying actually he wasn't held accountable in the same way. He really was viewed as an unintentional killer because he didn't really understand what was going to happen, and he hadn't experienced this yet. So Rabbi Ezra Bick, who's a contemporary Tanach scholar, takes this approach. And he has a very interesting take on the whole story, because this approach really requires us to look at the story in a different way. So Reb Ezra Bick says that his approach is this, is that the murder was unintentional, first of all, and and because Cain didn't realize what murder was. And he also says, overall, if you read this story, you actually emerge with not a bad impression of Cain. That's his take on it. He says, first of all, the Cain is not generally portrayed, in his view, tell me, I want to hear what you guys think about this if you buy it. He thinks Cain is not generally portrayed in these psukim as a villain. First of all, his name attests to this like great spiritual awareness that he has, Aniti Isha Hashem, this idea of being a partner with Hashem, that's what his name is. Whereas Hevel means like nothingness, right? And Hevel, Hevel appears about 40 times in Tanach. And in every other context besides here, it has, it appears more than 40 times in Tanach, but it appears probably like 60 or 70 times in Tanach. And every time that it appears with a negative connotation except for here. Okay? Like Hevel, Haval, and Hakol, Hevel, and Kohelet. So that's a negative connotation. So he says, first of all, even as their names appear, seem to like indicate that Cain actually has a pretty lofty spiritual like status. And also, as we pointed out last time, Cain is the first person to initiate sacrifice korbanot to Hashem. That's incredible. That shows he has this like deep spirituality. He's like seeking Hashem in his life. He's the first human being to do that. So and also as we saw in Pasuk Chet, Cain doesn't immediately kill his brother. He does try to talk to him first, and it sort of escalates and it doesn't turn out so well. But maybe that also indicates that it was sort of in the heat of the moment. It wasn't that he tried to kill him, but it was like they had an argument and things escalated, and he ultimately ended up killing him, but he didn't really mean to kill him, and maybe he didn't even realize what he was doing when he did it. So it's interesting, Rabbi reads the whole story as sort of presenting a more positive view of Cain than like the other Mafarshim do, or certainly than the Kliyakar does. Okay, so you see how things, all of these things, you have to read it in context, and all of these hints together sort of build up to our thinking that maybe Cain was actually like had his strengths, so he wasn't such a bad guy. Yeah.
I think it also just shows like that Cain is a little more like humane. Like I think that you could read it as a heavily like perfect person kind of thing. And like Cain like killed obviously he's like the first person on earth to kill, so maybe he didn't know it was wrong, so we could like give him the benefit of doubt. But that he's just like we can learn from like him like in terms of like growth. He isn't perfect. And I feel like it just shows a little more, you can relate more time. You can't really never know how, but you can, it's just like, like doing wrong and just
Right. Exactly. It wasn't like some evil
not
murder.
bad, not necessarily bad intention, it's just like what went wrong.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Richard says. It's basically very similar to that. Is that he says this story, when we see Cain through this more like charitable lens, when we look at the fact of like what his name represents, when we looked at the fact that he initiated korbanot, what we see is, and the fact that he tried to talk to his brother about their differences and everything, what we see is that this isn't really a story about like a cold-blooded murderer. This is a story basically about competition. And it's about this idea that Cain just like, when it felt to him that when his korban was rejected and Havel's wasn't, it felt like that competition felt dangerous to him. And it sort of escalated from there. And that when Hashem says, why are you upset? What he's saying is, you're not in competition. Don't worry about it. His korban, your korban, they're two different things. You don't have to feel so threatened by the fact that someone else is successful. And you don't have to go to that place of viewing yourself in competition with everyone around you. And Cain doesn't rise to that, right? He can't. He gets too mired and too upset about this sense of his own inferiority and this feeling of competition. But what Rivka basically says is that if you read the story this way, as like basically a well-meaning person who even had some spiritual greatness, and then ultimately, like because he feels so threatened by his brother's success, if things sort of escalate and he ends up killing him without even sort of realizing what he's doing, and that's why he gets exiled. He says what we see is this is not really a story about murder and punishment. It's a story about human nature as feeling sort of inherently in competition with other people. And that what Rivka says is that it actually is telling us that this dynamic exists even in good people, which is what he thinks Cain was. It exists even in good people, and exists even in the simplest sort of social unit of the family. It's just like a fundamental thing. You can't even like a good person, even just with his brother, even in this like small family, even their competition is a danger. And that basically what we should take from the story is not that like Cain was a horrible murderer and humanity is doomed, right? But more like competition is a real mishul, right? It's something we really have to contend with. It's something that's that's like innate, that even like good people with their siblings can feel. And so we have to be sort of aware of that and recognize like the dangers of viewing ourselves as always in competition with someone else. Did you have a question?
Yeah, but how does Rav like resolve the issue that all the other Mefarshim say that he pulls Hevel to the field to like find a pretext to kill him?
So he doesn't accept that approach, right? So that is an idea in the Midrash. But he doesn't accept that approach. He says that he actually, in Pshat, if you look at it, he went to the field and he tried to talk. He tried to have a reasonable conversation. And that conversation isn't recorded, but we know that they tried to have a conversation because the Torah tells us that. And he says, "Vayomer Kayin al Havelaki, vayivi yotza sadeh." And he tried that approach, and then ultimately things escalated out of control. Vayakam Kayin al Havelaki, vayahar David. But that's not what he intended initially. That's how he reads it. So you're right, he's at odds with that idea in the Midrash, and then some of them are arguing. Any thoughts about that? Is that compelling to you, or is that like, well,
I think it's like nice, not nice, but like it is cool to like relate to like kind of like the person being on earth, to know that like they're not so far off from us. Like to know that they like people have always been like jealous and like competition like forever. It's a normal thing.
Right, exactly. That even if you're not going to go like kill someone, right? That instinct toward jealousy and competition is like so innate in the human condition, and something to really be aware of, and the potential that it can have. So we sort of saw in terms of well, why was an exile and not the death penalty, or sort of how do we understand what Kayin felt? So we saw the approach of the Kliyakar, that totally the reason it was exile was that's even worse because it was exile and then the death penalty. We saw the approach of Rivka, so sort of an intermediate position is the idea of Rav Breuer. Okay, who's another Tanach scholar, and his concept sort of starts with this. Why was Kayin exiled and not murdered? So he thinks, his suggestion is that in general, in Sefer Bereshit, the way we have to look at Sefer Bereshit is no one in Sefer Bereshit is just an individual. Okay, everyone in Sefer Bereshit represents a lineage. He says if you don't think of it that way, he says nothing in Sefer Bereshit makes sense. If you don't think of it as like each person represents not just himself but a lineage, then why on earth did Abraham send away one of his children? That's crazy. No one does it. But he did it because we're talking about like, the beginnings of nations. We're not just talking about like, normal family relationships. He says, why would Yaakov prefer one grandchild over another? That's like totally, if we're not reading it in the context of Sefer Bereshit and how what people represent there, that's like completely dysfunctional. Right? Why would Yaakov steal his brother's bracha? All of these things make no sense if you're just thinking of this as like normal personal relationships. They only make sense if you're thinking about them as like the beginning of a lineage. Okay? And so what he says is that what Hashem saw in Kayin, it's not just about one brother and another brother, and one brother kills the other brother, and so he should get the death penalty. That's not what it is. Kayin represents the beginning of a line. He represents a dynasty. And what Hashem sees in Kayin is that he has like an innate violence in him. Okay? He has this violence to him. And what's interesting is that in fact, that is what we see of the Keni throughout Tanach. The Keni is seen as the sort of like violent nomadic people. Okay? And we see that even what's really interesting is even in heroic contexts, right? The one person we know who's a Keni, who is a hero, anyone know who it is? Yael Isha Seder HaKeni. Yael was a Keni. But what's so interesting about Yael? She's a hero. She's an amazing person, right? But what does she do? She does it violently. She's a very, that whole image of how she like plunges the stick through the peg through his head. There's a very like violent image to that. And so what he's saying is this is an innate like sort of quality of this line, of this lineage. And we see it emerge throughout history, even in heroic contexts. And so what Hashem says is, given that this is like who you are, and that you're not just yourself, a human being who should get whatever just punishment, but you're like, you know, the father of a lineage, what makes sense for your lineage is that you should not be too rooted in one place. You shouldn't have too much constancy, because when you have your own land and you have that tendency toward violence, then there's a lot of bad things that can happen. Right? So if you sort of have to be nomadic and wander around, you never get too much power, too much wealth, too much control, then it can sort of be okay. Right? But if you actually set up like a kingdom in one place and you have that violent streak, then that can end up being very negative for humanity. And so that's basically why he is. Again, it's not like this question of did he kill him on purpose or not? And was it amazing or the Shogegen, so does he get exiled? Does he get the death penalty? It's really not about that, because none of these people are just individual human beings. They all represent like a start of something in history. And as a start of something in history, it makes sense for the Katie, given what we've seen in Ryan, to have more of this like nomadic, wandering, less rooted lifestyle. And so that's how he just sort of changes the question altogether. So you sort of think of this as like three different potential approaches to understanding what we learn from this punishment of Cain, of sort of like that the one idea of Cain of like the internal moral compass, and that what he got was actually even worse than the death penalty, and the totally opposite approach that maybe what we learned from this is really about competition even in good people, and that's why he only got exiled. We're finally just sort of saying this isn't really a punishment so much for killing for like individual human being for killing his brother, as much as it's a response to, if this is your nature, then the best way for you to contribute to the world is by not having one place where you're anchored, by not being allowed to sort of accumulate power and autonomy too much.
What opinion, what was the name of the person that wrote that?
That was Rick Breuer. Okay? So those are a few different perspectives on that. Any questions about that, or one that like speaks to you in particular?
I like the last one.
It's interesting to think about your sheet that way, to sort of frame it for yourself, is like, think about which stories would we interpret differently once we start sort of framing it for ourselves as not stories of individuals, more stories of like the start of history, the start of lines. It's like an interesting notion, and it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking a lot of the things that we read in the story of the Avot that seem like incredibly hard to understand, and like we can't really believe that they did that. It makes a lot more sense when you frame it as in terms of like a dynasty than if you think about it in terms of individuals.
Can I just ask you what the second opinion was again? The first one was the internal moral compass, and then the last one was a response to...
Right. So the second one was the idea that Cain himself as an individual actually seems to have a lot of like good qualities, and so that maybe what we see is that he wasn't really a cold-blooded murderer, and the reason he got exiled was because exile, like Ari Mikvah, that's the punishment for an unintentional murder. And so it's not a cold-blooded murder. We don't learn about this about like, this isn't really about murder and punishment. It's about how their competition like escalated into an unintentional murder, and it sort of teaches us about the power of competition and jealousy even in like generally good people. Okay? Okay, that was worth it. Okay, so now let's think about this story, sort of broadly speaking, in its relation, in the context of the sweep of the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, about basically this, which is basically the story of the descent of man. Right? We read the whole beginning of Sefer Bereshit, Parshat Bereshit especially, is about the descent of man leading up to Parshat Noach, leading up to the book. Okay? And then you even see in Parshat Noach, we see another couple of stories like that. So let's think for a moment of what role this particular story of Cain and Abel that we've learned a lot about over the last few weeks, a lot of different like angles on it, what role it plays in the general story of the descent of man. So for this, let's actually we have a few more minutes, maybe we can try to at least learn most of this. Go back to the Chavruta, and if you could look at the chart, which is the last source on your page, which compares, these are comparisons that were pointed out by Jonathan Grossman, who's a contemporary Tanach scholar, written a lot of recent articles, about the parallels between the story of the Chait Hadat with Adam and Chava and the story of Cain and Abel. And so what I'd like to do in Chavruta, at least to begin, is to look at these parallels and try to put, I left these boxes next to it open, so you could sort of give a title to each one, right? Describe what is the similarity between the two.